Alright everyone, welcome back to another King Japes video. Now today we're going to be talking about 35mm film photography. More specifically, I'm going to be giving you guys a complete guide on every single 35mm film stock from Kodak that is currently in production. And I wanted to do this video for a couple of different reasons. First and foremost, I wanted to give you guys a resource, especially if you are a new film photographer or even an advanced shooter, just so you guys can see sample photos from every single Kodak film that is currently in production, but also to give you guys tips and tricks on how to get the best possible results from each of these film stocks. But before we jump into this episode, I want to give a shout out to the sponsor for this segment of the video, which is the good folks over at Squarespace. Squarespace is your all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Now, if you're looking to take your photography to the next level, you need to create your own professional website. With Squarespace Blueprint and SEO tools, you have a ton of award-winning templates you can use to get your website up and running within minutes. You have an option for a portfolio, and you even have options for an e-commerce store, which you can set up super simple using their drag and drop system. And one of the best perks about using Squarespace is that they have flexible payment options, which give your customers the flexibility to pay the way they want to. Head over to squarespace.com/KingJapes and enter promo code KingJapes at checkout, and you guys are going to get 10% off of your first purchase of a domain or a website. Huge thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Alright everyone, so today we're going to be talking about a total of 8 different film stocks, and these film stocks are going to range from slide film to color negative. Now I am not going to talk about any of the black and white film just because I think that's a whole separate video, and as we run through each of these different film stocks, please feel free to either skip or maybe even go back and pause if you want to sit there and take notes, because a lot of the information we're going to be talking about are very specific to each of these film stocks. But with that said, in no particular order, let's jump in. Alright, so the first film stock we're going to be talking about today is going to be the Portra lineup. Now, Portra 160 is the lowest ISO variant of the Portra lineup. There's 160, there's 400, as well as 800 ISO. But it's important to note that each of the different Portras give you vastly different looks. But to kick it off, Portra 160 is the lowest ISO of the bunch, which results in the finest grain. Portra 160, in my experience, is ideal for daylight shooting, so when you have a lot of available light. And in my opinion, it is the most clean of all of the Portras. And being that it is marketed as a 160 ISO film, I actually like to slightly overexpose my film and shoot it at 100 ISO. You see, Portra 160 has an extremely good exposure latitude, and it actually does really well with overexposure. It gives you a lot of nice pastel colors, as well as a nice medium contrast that's essentially going to bring your images to life and really give it that nice film look, while giving you that flexibility to shoot it in a wide array of applications such as portraits or even landscapes. Now moving on to Portra 400. Portra 400 is easily the most popular film stock in the film photography world, and for good reason. First and foremost, it is a 400 ISO film, which makes it extremely versatile because you can shoot this in cloudy weather, you can shoot this in sunny weather, and you can even shoot it indoors if you have a nice flash. In terms of grain, it actually has really nice grain structure. Now, my best results from Portra 400 have always been from first and foremost getting the correct exposure. But it's also important to note that Portra 400 has one of the best film latitudes out of all of the 35mm films available. In fact, what I like to do after getting the correct exposure is actually overexpose it by stop. And a lot of people will tell you, you don't overexpose your film all the time, you don't need to. But with a film like Portra 400, even if you overexpose it a stop, maybe even 2 stops, you're gonna be able to pull that back in post if you need to. And because of the latitude, it's going to retain a ton of information in those highlights. Now, I personally use Portra 400 for everything, whether that's my portrait work, whether that be street photography or landscape. And in my opinion, it's just the most versatile film. All right, so moving on to the next film, we have Portra 800. Now, Portra 800 out of the bunch is going to give you the strongest grain structure. And one common theme with all the Portras is if you underexpose your film, you're gonna see more grain. But because this is an 800 ISO film, that grain is gonna be a lot more prominent. And so one tip you would always need to do is try to get the best possible exposure. Sometimes I even meter for the shadows. And this just means when you see a scene, you're gonna find the shadow area of the scene, and you're gonna get the exposure for what the shadow area is. But out of the bunch, folks, Portra 800 is probably my second favorite. It goes 400, 800, and then 160 in my rankings. And Portra 800 gives you more of a cine-like look. It has this weird kind of movie look to it. There's a lot of cyan colors. And so if you're looking for more of a cinematic look in your photographs, I would recommend Portra 800. But there you have it. Portra 800, definitely one of my favorites. Now, the next film stock we're gonna be talking about is Kodak Ektar 100. Now, Ektar 100, in my opinion, is one of the trickiest film stocks to shoot. And the reason reason for that is because it has a low exposure latitude, which means if you overexpose Ektar 100, it's not going to really do that well. You see, Ektar 100 is known to give you really nice and deeply saturated colors. But being that it is a 100 ISO film, you are going to have extremely nice grain structure. Sometimes you don't even notice that it's there. It is ideal for daytime shooting, and so anytime that I think Ektar 100, I personally only use it for landscapes, and that is when I have gotten the best results from this film stock. I think that when you shoot it for portraits, it makes the skin look a little bit too saturated. On lighter tone skin, it gives it more of like a red tint, and it's just not as flattering. So in my opinion, I wouldn't use Ektar 100 for portraits. And even though it's not my favorite film stock, if you shoot it right and you get the correct exposure every single time, it has produced really, really great results for me. Moving on, we're gonna be talking about the only slide film from the bunch, and that is Kodak E100 or Ektachrome. Ektachrome has extremely fine grain, really nice and saturated color, but in my experience is extremely finicky when it comes to exposure. I remember shooting this film a lot in Chicago, and one thing that I noticed is that in contrasty scenes where there's a lot of highlight and shadow play, it doesn't really do that well. In my opinion, in order to get the best results from Ektachrome, you need to shoot it in like cloudy weather almost, where the light is nice and flat and diffused. I also noticed that this film stock gets really cool, and so some people have been saying they could, put a warming filter on it and get really good results. I have yet to do that, and so just be careful when you shoot Ektachrome. First and foremost, you always want to nail exposure with slide film, and secondly, try to shoot it in flat light, but the cool thing is when you get the film developed, you get the negatives back and they are actually positives, and so you can see it under a light box, and it's really, really cool to look at. Now moving on to Kodak Pro Image 100. Now I gotta be honest, this film is one that I don't really have too much experience with. Pro Image 100 has extremely fine grain. It is 100 ISO. In terms of colors and saturation, I would say that it doesn't really have really deep colors. In my opinion, it gives it more like a warm, neutral kind of feel. And in some instances, I've seen kind of green undertones in the shadows. And as for exposure latitude, it actually has a nice exposure latitude. I would still be comfortable overexposing this film by maybe a stop. So my recommendation for Pro Image 100 to get the best results is to nail exposure, or if the film has good exposure latitude, you can slightly overexpose it and still get really nice results. Next on the list is one of my favorite film stocks of all time, and that is Kodak Gold 200. Now, Kodak Gold 200 is, of course, a 200 ISO film stock, but unlike some of the other films, it can kind of get a little grainy. In terms of grain, on a scale of like 1 to 10, I would say most of the time it's always going to be at a constant 6 or 7. And so if you're looking for more of like a classic vintage feel to your images, I think Kodak Gold 200 is a really, really nice film for that. It's going to give you a lot of nice warm tones, as well as nice contrast between your highlights and shadows. So I use this a lot for street photography as well. But where I personally feel like Kodak Gold shines is when you shoot it for landscapes. At 200 ISO, you need to shoot this when, there is a lot of available light. And when you pair this with a nice, beautiful sunset, I know that sounds really cliche, anything that has like a nice warm tone to it, it's going to really thrive in that environment. Now, I've shot a ton of Kodak Gold 200, so I know that the exposure latitude is extremely, extremely good. So, even if you underexpose it slightly, you're still gonna be able to get nice and usable results. And that's one of the reasons why this is my favorite film stock. Next up, we have Kodak Color Plus 200. Now, Kodak Color Plus 200 is also often referred to as Kodacolor. Generally speaking though, this film has really nice grain. And being 200 ISO, I think that it has a little bit more fine grain than Kodak Gold. It has really good exposure latitude, and one of the reasons why I love this film is because it is fairly inexpensive. I think you could still get it for around $7 to $8 a roll, and when compared to Portra prices, that is about a $10 difference. This film is good if you really want a nice pop of color. I like to use it a lot in my point and shoot film cameras, and it also handles portraits and landscapes really well. 200 ISO means you're gonna need a lot of light, and so those are some of the main things that I like to photograph Kodak Color Plus 200 in. And last but not least, folks, we have Kodak Ultramax 400. Now, Ultramax 400 is one of those more inexpensive film stocks as well. You can go to Walgreens, CVS, any of these drugstores and purchase the film. Now, I like to call Ultramax 400 the poor man's Portra 400, just because it gives you a lot of the same characteristics as Portra. You get great exposure latitude, you get really nice and saturated colors, you get nice contrast in your images, but in terms of grain, this is kind of where I feel like it starts to fall apart. Even when you get correct exposure and you're shooting in the daylight, the grain still tends to come through. And so if that's something that you don't mind, I would still recommend Ultramax 400. It's a nice portrait film. It gives you nice warm tones. I've used it for street photography and even for landscapes. Really versatile like Portra 400. The main takeaway from me though is that you tend to see more grain from it than you would with Portra 400s. But there you have it, folks. There is a little guide to all of the Kodak color films and how to achieve the best results with some tips and tricks. If you guys enjoyed this video, drop a like down below and also hit that subscribe button if you guys want to see more film photography content. I've been doing this now 5 or 6 years, and the goal with my videos are essentially just to give you guys a resource on anybody looking to get into film, whether you're a beginner or maybe an advanced shooter. I want my channel to be somewhere you can go to where you can learn as well as just get a good reference. So that's gonna wrap it up. I'll see you guys in the next episode. As always, Minolta Gang.